President Trump ordering pharma companies to lower drug prices in the United States over the next 60 days. Joining us right now to talk about this and changes at the FDA, plus much more, is former FDA Commissioner Scott Gottlieb. He's also a CNBC contributor and a board member of both Illumina and Pfizer. And Scott, let's talk through what this might mean. This is a strict letter. President Trump tried to do this in the first Trump administration with an executive order that the courts struck down. How likely is this to get some pickup from the industry? Do you think they'll go along with it?
Look, I think this is a good starting point for the industry to have discussions with the administration. The president clearly is focused on this issue. He has been through two terms right now. This sense that there is unfairness between the United States and our Western allies, mostly in Europe, who are paying much less for pharmaceuticals in the U.S. I think it's a fundamental issue of fairness for him. He tried to do this through a regulation in the first term, through a demonstration project at the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. That was struck down. In the second term, he's begun to try to do that again. I think this may be an indication that they're having difficulty coming up with a regulatory framework that's going to pass judicial review. And so they're looking to do it through negotiation and a little bit of jawboning. I think this is a good starting point. They recognized in the letter that the president put out that this should apply prospectively, meaning that companies can't go back and renegotiate the prices that they've already established in a lot of these countries. So he's saying that he wants companies to do this on a prospective basis, basically for new drug launches within the commercial and the Medicare market. The one piece of this I think is going to be very difficult for the companies is that he wants the companies to offer the MFN price, the most favored nation price, day one within the Medicaid program. That's not necessarily going to benefit patients. It will benefit states by lowering their drug spending. But that's going to be very difficult in terms of the revenue hit to companies. In many cases, the difference between the MFN price, depending on how you calculate that, and the letter doesn't specify that, and the prices paid in Medicaid could be substantial for some single-source drugs. Ultimately, and my final point here would be, I think we need to move towards some type of tiered pricing globally, where you basically price drugs based on the wealth of nations, and you have different prices for low, middle, and high-income nations, because a country like Germany, with a GDP per capita of $54,000 per person, can pay a lot more than Vietnam with a GDP per capita of $4,000. So I think we do need to price public health goods to what countries can pay and their wealth ultimately. But this is a good starting point.
That sounds like something that the United States Trade Representative would have to enforce. Are you suggesting that what we get out of this is not lower prices in the United States, but higher prices in other developed countries?
Well, I think it's both. And the president, in those letters that he sent, was very clear that he wants prices in the U.S. to come down if prices in Europe and other nations are going to go up. And they did commit that the trade representative and other entities within the U.S. would support companies. That's going to be critical. There was a moment in time where we tried to negotiate some of these provisions into free trade agreements. It got into the FTA with Australia and South Korea as well. I think we need to go back to that, where the U.S. trade apparatus is willing to support companies that try to push back on some of these pricing authorities globally. But the president was clear in the letter that he would expect that if the United States does support manufacturers in being able to raise their prices overseas, that would mean lower prices in the U.S. Now, ultimately, how you measure that would be difficult, but I think there are ways that you could probably look at that over the long run. But, I think in terms of where the administration's position has been and what we knew the president wanted to do, there were some things in this letter that I think were some thoughtful, frankly, concessions on the part of the administration, particularly that provision about looking at this mostly on a prospective basis for new drug launches, with the exception of within the Medicaid program. The one piece of this I think could immediately impact consumers, and the industry has been having discussions with the administration about this, is offering some kind of portal, some kind of online portal, a direct-to-consumer portal, where companies would agree to sell to consumers directly, for those who are underinsured or uninsured, drugs at MFN-type pricing for heavily rebated drugs. And in those instances, probably the ex-U.S. prices are pretty close to the U.S.-based prices once you factor in all the rebates that are paid in the U.S. And so that's something that could provide some immediate savings to certain consumers.
That might work. Scott, I'm just trying to historically figure out how we got in this mess and who's to blame. I mean, the first time someone over in Europe suggested that they were going to start controlling prices, who went along with that? Was our government asleep, or FTC or trade regulator? Did the companies just allow themselves to be taken advantage of just to continue to be able to sell abroad? Or How did we? I mean, we let this happen to us, so now we're in this position. It should have never happened in the first place. How did it happen?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of all the above. U.S. authorities let other countries put in place these price control regimes and didn't support manufacturers in pushing back against those. And it's hard to do if you're a private company.
Whose administration was that?
Government.
When was that happening?
Yeah, when did most favored nation?
Yeah, I mean, that really happened over, I would say, the late 1990s and early 2000s. A lot of these regimes went in. Some of them went in earlier than that. If you look at countries like the UK, Germany started to put these really draconian provisions in place probably in the mid-2000s. But the bottom line is, if you're selling a pharmaceutical product, number one, you want to price it to what the market can pay because these are public health goods. And also, these cost very little to manufacture. That's just the bottom line. The cost of goods is very low. And so if you can still eke out a profit in Germany, selling it at 50% of the price you can gain in the U.S., that's still profit to be had. So companies are going to try to sell as much as they can to as many countries as they can based on what those markets are willing to pay. I think if the USTR is willing to step in here and really support manufacturers in pushing back against some of these regimes and make this a component of how they negotiate overall trade agreements, the U.S. administration, I think we can make some real progress here. And I think this letter, frankly, was a good starting point. I was surprised yesterday by the negative reaction in the markets relative to where the president has been. This is no surprise. And I think they did make some thoughtful movements here, the one being looking at this just on a prospective basis for most drugs. That's going to allow companies to go into these markets now and say, we're launching this drug at a world price, take it or leave it. And then you're going to need the support of the U.S. government to make sure they don't compulsory license that medicine.
Scott, let's switch gears. We had Dr. Marty Makary here, the current head of the FDA, earlier this week. One of the things we brought up with him is what's happening with gene therapy, other innovative therapies and drugs that are out there, because there have been some concerns, particularly around what we saw with Sarepta. What are you hearing?
Well, look, there's been about 4 recent situations with respect to gene therapy in particular and things that went through that biologics center where you saw a recent departure of the head of that center that surprised not just, I think, the markets and consumers, but also the companies. And you saw them put out statements, and I think you referenced this in that interview, where companies, the CEOs said, we were surprised, we felt basically the rug was pulled out from us at the 11th hour. You don't typically see companies come out and make statements like that unless they really think the rules were changed on them. I think the larger story here has been just the degradation at the agency in terms of departures. That biologics center has seen 106 departures since the beginning of the year. That's on top of about 150 RIFs that were also part of that center. If you look at the drug center, they lost about a third of the reviewers that review breast and gynecological cancer products. They lost more than half of the group that reviews malignant heme products. They've seen 473 departures of medical reviewers, voluntary departures, on top of about 600 RIFs. That's more than 20% of that center. So you're seeing a hollowing out of the scientific staff at the FDA, and that's starting to impact early reviews. When you talk to the companies, and I do talk to a lot of small companies, I work at a venture capital firm, they're starting to say that the feedback that they're getting from the agency and their ability to engage with the agency, have meetings, are not as robust as they used to be. Things that used to be meetings in the past where you'd get verbal feedback now are written response only and things like that. Bio actually did a survey of its members, and they quantified this. They haven't put out the results of that survey yet, but they're quantifying on a systematic basis that the quality and the pace of the interactions that early companies have with the agency has gone down, which is not surprising given the scope of the departures and the firings that we've seen at FDA. It's going to have an impact. So there's rebuilding to be done right now at the agency.
Vinay Prasad leaving, does that improve the situation? Does it change the situation? Or is it too late because these people have left and it's going to take a lot of time to rehire among those ranks?
Well, I think it's going to improve morale if you talk to people within that biologics center and how they felt about the leadership composition within that center. And it's going to, of course, depend on who they get in place. There's discussion that, that Kennedy, Secretary Kennedy, was supporting Vinay Prasad, and part of the concession that was made in terms of getting Kennedy to agree to his departure was that the vaccine group would be split out from the biologics center, and they would appoint a new head of that vaccine group, presumably someone who shares Secretary Kennedy's views about vaccines. I think that would be very destructive to the agency and further erode morale. So things like that are allowed to happen where you get people who are anti-vaxxers, for example, to oversee the vaccine division, it doesn't just affect vaccine review, it affects the overall morale in the agency, where people in the agency who are scientists, who are dedicated to the public health mission of that organization, feel that there is, political meddling and intrusion in the decision-making, and that they can't exercise their scientific judgment because there's sort of preconceived notions about what the outcome should be. And that's a feeling that's permeating that agency right now when you talk to the rank and file. So I think we need to get back to basics with FDA and try to support the scientific decision-making of the staff and support recruiting good people into that agency and retaining them.